case of the poisoned bookseller, the Holmes Files. Dear friends, we are so glad to welcome you once again, and we are absolutely delighted to have your company this evening. A heartfelt greeting tonight to our listeners in Canada, the USA, and Cyprus. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from and tell us what is the most beautiful village or countryside you've ever visited. Settle in, get comfortable, and now let the story unfold. Chapter 1. The Message at Baker Street. The fog came down over London that November, like a shroud settling over a coffin, thick and yellow, and smelling faintly of coal smoke and the river. At 221B Baker Street, the gas lamps burned low, and Sherlock Holmes sat motionless in his chair by the fire, his violin resting across his knees, untouched for the better part of an hour. It was not idleness. I had learned, in my years beside him, to recognize the particular stillness that came over Holmes when his mind was working at its most furious pace on nothing at all. A stillness that always, sooner or later, broke. It broke at 9:30, when we heard the bell ring below with an urgency that suggested the caller's hand had not left the pull. "A messenger," Holmes said, before Mrs. Hudson had so much as reached the door, running and frightened. I confess I heard nothing but the fog-muffled scrape of footsteps on the stair, but I had long since stopped doubting such pronouncements. The boy who entered, perhaps 14, cap in hand, breath still ragged, held out a folded note with a trembling arm. Holmes took it, read it in a single glance, and I watched something kindle behind his grey eyes that I recognized as well as I recognized my own reflection, the particular light of a problem worth having. "Well, Watson," he said, passing me the note, "it seems Cecil Court has produced something more interesting than second-hand poetry tonight." The note was brief, written in an unsteady hand I did not recognize. "Mr. Holmes, come at once. Argus Pemberton is dead in his shop. The doctor says poison, but the door was locked from within and the windows barred. I do not understand it, and I am afraid I never shall without your help. Ince Pitsuji." "Lestrade Pemberton," I said. The name is familiar. The bookseller, a dealer in rare and antiquarian volumes, first editions, manuscripts, the occasional item of more delicate provenance than his catalogue would admit. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "I purchased a monograph on medieval cipher work from him not 18 months ago. A careful man, Watson. Methodical, not the sort to admit poison into his own shop by accident." "You think it deliberate, then?" "I think nothing yet. That is precisely the pleasure of it." He paused at the door, and for a moment the urgency left his face entirely, replaced by something quieter, almost solemn. A man locked into a room with only his books for company, and something reaches in regardless and stops his heart. There is a story in that, Watson, whatever the truth of it proves to be. Come, the trail is only hours old, and Lestrade will have trampled half of it by the time we arrive. The handsome ride to Cecil Court took us through streets nearly emptied by the weather, the fog pressing close against the windows so that the gas lamps we passed appeared only as smudges of sickly light, swallowed again almost as soon as they were seen. Holmes said nothing the entire way, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the glass that I understood was not London at all, but the shape of the problem itself, already turning in his mind. "A locked door," I ventured, "and barred windows. If the facts are as Lestrade describes, then no one could have entered or left the shop after the poison took effect." "So it would seem. Then either Pemberton took the poison himself, unlikely for a man with no apparent motive for self-destruction and no vessel yet found to have contained it, or someone administered it before the door was locked and left before the effects were felt. Better. Though it raises its own difficulty, poisons vary widely in their patience, Watson, and a man does not generally lock himself into his own shop for the night and continue about his business for an hour or more with a fatal dose already working in him, without remark, without complaint, without so much as a note left behind explaining his distress." Holmes turned from the window at last. "There is a third possibility, of course, which is that the door was not in fact locked from within in the manner everyone presently believes." His eyes glittered faintly in the passing lamplight, Facts reported second-hand, Watson, in the heat of discovery, by frightened men in an unfamiliar situation, are rarely facts at all. They are impressions, dressed up as certainty. I intend to see the lock myself before I credit anyone's account of it. We turned off the main thoroughfare into the narrow confines of Cecil Court, and even through the fog I could see the cluster of lanterns ahead, and the dark, huddled shapes of constables standing sentry before a shop front whose window, I noted with a small chill, still bore, in gilt lettering half obscured by grime and years, the name A. Pemberton, bookseller, EST, 1861. Lestrade himself stood in the doorway, his face pale in the lantern light, and when he saw us approaching through the fog, he did not offer his usual clipped greeting. He simply stepped aside and said, in a voice unlike his own, "I hope you can make sense of this, Mr. Holmes, because I confess I cannot, and I have seen a great many strange things in this profession." Holmes said nothing. He only stepped past the inspector into the shop, and I saw his eyes begin, at once, their swift and terrible work, moving across the threshold, the doorframe, the floor beyond, cataloguing in an instant 100 details that would take Lestrade's men the better part of a week to notice, if they noticed them at all. I followed him inside, and the door swung shut behind us, sealing out the fog, and whatever answer it was that had walked into that shop before us, and, by every account we had yet heard, found no way to walk back out. I'll continue straight into Chapter 2 now, and keep going chapter by chapter without stopping, per your instructions. I'll flag it only if I hit an output cutoff, at which point just say continue, and I'll pick up exactly where I left off. Chapter 2. The Shop on Cecil Court. The interior of Pemberton's shop was narrower than its frontage suggested. A deep corridor of a room lined floor to ceiling, with shelves that leaned inward at the top, like trees grown too close together in a wood, so that a man walking its length might have felt himself descending into a tunnel of leather bindings and yellowed paper. The smell was of dust and tallow and something else beneath it. Faint, sweetish, and wrong. Argus Pemberton lay behind his counter at the far end, on his back, one arm flung out across an open ledger, his spectacles knocked askew but still, oddly, upon his nose. He had been a small, neat man in life, by the look of what remained of him, and death had not entirely undone that neatness. There was no violence in his posture, no struggle written into the set of his limbs, only a terrible stillness, and a face frozen in an expression I found difficult to name. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to confusion. The police surgeon puts death at some hours before we found him, Lestrade said from the doorway, seemingly unwilling to come further in than necessary. The shop boy, a lad named Curtis, works here afternoons. Found him at 8, when he came to collect his wages. Says the shop was locked exactly as always, and he let himself in with his own key. Pemberton was already cold. And the door was locked when the boy arrived. You are certain of this from his account, and not simply assuming it because the door required a key to open. He says the bolt was thrown as well as the lock turned. Pemberton always threw the bolt after closing, apparently, habit of a man who'd been robbed once, years back. Holmes had not yet spoken. He was crouched by the body, his lens already in hand, examining the dead man's fingers with the close, silent attention he gave to nothing else in the world quite so completely. "The nails," he murmured, half to himself. Blue at the bed, and here, a faint discoloration at the lips, more violet than blue. He looked up sharply. "Watson, your opinion, as a medical man." I knelt beside him, reluctant as I always was to view death so intimately, and yet unable, after so many years, to resist the pull of the puzzle any more than Holmes himself could. "Cyanosis," I said, "consistent with a number of poisons that interfere with the blood's capacity to carry oxygen. Was there any cry heard? Any sound of distress?" "None reported," Lestrade said. "The shops to either side were shut for the evening. No one was near enough to hear, if there was anything to hear at all." "Which suggests either a poison swift enough to prevent outcry," I said, "or one that produced no pain sufficient to provoke it, or a man too proud or too startled to cry out." Holmes said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made me look up. He was no longer looking at the body. He was looking at the desk before it, at a small glass of what appeared to be sherry, half-finished, sitting beside the ledger, and beside that, an open box of what I took at first for chocolates, wrapped in twists of violet paper. "Has anything been moved?" Holmes asked, without turning. "Nothing, Mr. Holmes. I gave strict orders." "Then observe with me, gentlemen, before this scene is trampled into meaninglessness by well-intentioned hands." Holmes lifted the glass with a handkerchief, holding it to the lamplight, turning it with the delicate care of a man handling something explosive. "Sherry, untouched by any visible residue, but residue is not always visible, and I shall want this analyzed before I trust it either way." He set it down and turned instead to the box of sweets. "And these, how many, Lestrade, do you count remaining?" The inspector peered in, uneasy. 6, 7 perhaps. 7, Holmes said, and the box, unless I am very much mistaken, was purchased to hold a dozen. He indicated a faint printed number, near invisible beneath the lid's fold, which means some 5 have already been consumed, by our victim, presumably, over the course of an evening otherwise spent, by all appearances, quietly at his ledgers. He straightened, and I saw the particular brightness come into his eyes that told me a shape was beginning, however faintly, to emerge from the fog of facts. A man does not eat 5 sweets from a box left conveniently upon his own desk without believing them entirely safe, which tells us something important, Watson, that whatever killed Argus Pemberton, it was not something he feared. It came to him disguised as a kindness. "A gift, then," I said. "From whom?" "That," Holmes said, moving now toward the shop's rear door with the swift, silent tread I had seen him employ 100 times before, is precisely what we must determine, along with rather more pressing question of how a poisoner contrived to leave a locked and bolted shop in the middle of a London evening without anyone whatsoever remarking upon his departure. He tried the rear door and found it, as expected, secured, bolted from the inside exactly as the front had been, the bolt itself thick with a fine and undisturbed layer of dust that told its own quiet story of long disuse. "Then how?" I began. "That," Holmes said, "is the question upon which this entire case now turns. And I do not yet have the answer, Watson, though I confess I begin to suspect where it is hiding." He crouched once more, this time by the small iron grate set into the shop's rear wall. A coal chute, long disused, its cover set slightly, almost imperceptibly, askew. "Lestrade, when was this shop last swept for coal deliveries?" The inspector's face had gone quite pale. "I've no idea, Mr. Holmes. I hadn't even noticed the thing." "No," Holmes said softly, running a gloved finger along the chute's rim and lifting it, in the lamplight, to reveal a faint smear of something dark and waxy caught beneath the edge. "Very few people do, which is, I rather suspect, precisely why our visitor chose it." He rose, and for the first time that evening, I saw something almost like satisfaction cross his features, the grim satisfaction of a hunter who has, at last, found the trail. "We are not looking, gentlemen, for a man who was let into this shop and let back out again," he said. "We are looking for a man, or perhaps," and here his eyes flicked, briefly, toward the ledger still pinned beneath the dead man's arm, "a woman who never needed the door at all." Chapter 3. The Trace of Poison. The coal chute told us a means, but not yet a method, and it was this distinction, Holmes reminded me, as we withdrew to the small back room that had evidently served Pemberton as both office and occasional parlour, that separated a solved case from a merely suggestive one. "A man may climb through a chute no wider than a barrel," Holmes said, seating himself upon the edge of Pemberton's worn armchair and steepling his fingers before him. "But he cannot climb through it carrying a syringe, a struggle, and an audible cry without leaving some trace of the violence required. And yet we have no violence here, Watson. We have a man who ate sweets from a box and drank half a glass of sherry and simply stopped. That is not the work of a poison delivered by force, That is the work of a poison delivered by trust. You believe the sweets themselves were tampered with before they ever reached this shop. I believe it is the likeliest explanation, though I withhold final judgment until Mr. Pemberton's stomach contents and the sweets themselves have been properly examined. Holmes rose and crossed to the small side table, lifting one of the violet-wrapped sweets with his handkerchief and holding it to the lamp. Observe the wrapping, Watson. The twist at either end is neat, professional, the work of a confectioner's shop, not an amateur hand refolding paper after tampering. Which means, if this sweet has indeed been altered, the alteration was performed with extraordinary care, likely by injection through the base, where the seam of the chocolate itself would conceal a puncture no larger than a needle's width. I confess I found myself leaning closer, despite my years of medical practice, which ought to have inured me to such details. What poison would answer to these symptoms? Cyanosis of the lips and nail beds, no apparent pain, no cry, and death within. What, an hour of ingestion? That, doctor, is rather your province than mine, though I have made some study of the matter. Holmes settled back, and here his tone shifted into the patient, almost lecturing cadence I had come to know well. The voice he used, not merely to think aloud, but to teach, when he judged the moment worth the instruction. There are perhaps a dozen substances available to a determined poisoner in this city that might produce such a death, but only a few that combine swift and near-painless action with the particular blue discoloration we observed. Prussic acid, cyanide in its common form, acts within minutes, often before a victim can so much as rise from his chair, and its scent, of bitter almonds, is frequently detectable by a sensitive nose, even now, hours later. He leaned forward and drew a slow breath near the dead man's mouth, then shook his head. None here, which rules out the swiftest and crudest of our candidates. Arsenic, then, antimony, both act more slowly, and both, in a fatal dose, tend to announce themselves rather violently. Cramping, vomiting, a struggle no amount of pride could entirely suppress. Our victim showed none of this. I think instead of something rarer, a cardiac poison, Watson, digitalis perhaps, or one of its more exotic cousins, a conic chief among them, extracted from the monk's hood that grows so innocently in half the gardens of England. Aconite kills by stopping the heart's own rhythm, often with numbness and tingling preceding collapse rather than pain. A victim might feel merely unwell, might attribute the sensation to fatigue or a poor supper, and continue about his business for the better part of an hour before the heart simply ceases. That would account for the ledger, I said slowly, glancing at the book still pinned beneath Pemberton's arm. A man who felt himself merely tired might well continue his accounts before retiring, unaware anything graver was occurring. Precisely so. And it is this. The interval, Watson, the gap between the poison's administration and its final effect, that makes this case a puzzle worth the name, rather than a mere brutality. Our poisoner did not need to be present at the moment of death. He needed only to ensure his gift was consumed at some point earlier in the evening, and trust the poison itself to do the rest, at its leisure, long after he, or she, was safely elsewhere. I found myself studying the ledger with fresh interest. And this book, do you suppose it holds some clue to who might have wished Pemberton harm? I intend to examine it closely, but not yet. First, Holmes rose again and crossed to the shelves lining the shop's rear wall, running his fingers along the spines with an attention that seemed, to my eye, almost tender. First, I wish to understand the man himself, Watson, before I trouble myself with his enemies. A bookseller's shop tells you a great deal about its keeper if you trouble to read it as carefully as he read his stock. He paused before a locked cabinet set apart from the general shelving, its glass front curtained from within, and tried the small brass handle. It did not give. Locked, he murmured, and separately from the shop itself, which was locked as a whole. A man does not trouble to lock a cabinet inside an already locked room unless what it contains is valuable enough to fear even his own household, or dangerous enough that he does not wish it easily found. Rare volumes, perhaps, You said yourself he dealt in items of, delicate provenance. Perhaps. Holmes's eyes had narrowed to the particular intensity I associated with the beginnings of a genuine theory. Not yet spoken, not yet even fully formed, but circling closer to the light. "Lestrade," he called, and the inspector appeared promptly in the doorway, clearly relieved to have some task set before him. "I shall want this cabinet opened, carefully, and its contents catalogued before anything is removed. And I shall want to know everyone who called upon Mr. Pemberton in the past fortnight. Customers, correspondents, tradesmen, all of them, however innocuous they may seem. That could be a long list, Mr. Holmes. He was well known in the trade. Then we shall begin narrowing it tonight." Holmes turned back to the ledger still trapped beneath the dead man's arm, and with the same careful reverence he had shown the sweets and the glass, began, at last, to ease it free. "Because I begin to suspect, gentlemen, that whoever sent Argus Pemberton his final gift of sweets did not do so out of any quarrel over books at all, but over whatever it is he kept locked away from even his own trusted customers, in a cabinet a good deal sturdier than the door that was meant to keep the whole world out." He opened the ledger to its final entries, and I watched his expression change, subtly, but unmistakably, from curiosity to something sharper, something almost like recognition. "Well," he said quietly, "that is unexpected. What is it?" Holmes did not answer at once. He merely turned the ledger toward me, his finger resting upon the last line entered in Pemberton's own careful hand, a name, followed by a sum that seemed, for a second-hand bookshop in Cecil Court, extraordinarily large, and said, in the tone of a man who has just found the first true thread of a very tangled skein, "It would seem, Watson, that our bookseller sold something 2 days before his death for very nearly £1,000. And I confess I have never, in all my years of study, heard of the item named here at all." Chapter 4. Interviews and Inconsistencies. The name in the ledger was the Raxford Codex, and beside it, in Pemberton's neat hand, a buyer's initials only. H.V. Holmes stared at the entry for a long moment, then closed the book with a decisiveness that told me he had already extracted from it everything it could presently offer. A codex I have never heard named in any catalogue, sold for a sum that would represent the better part of a year's trade for a shop this size, to a buyer identified by initials alone. He handed the ledger to Lestrade. "Have this examined for other recent entries of similar size. I suspect we shall find our poisoner's name somewhere within these pages, though perhaps not written quite so plainly as this." It was near midnight before we left Cecil Court, and Holmes spent the better part of the following morning, after a breakfast he barely touched. So absorbed was he in a stack of trade catalogues Mrs. Hudson had fetched from a subscription library at his urgent request, compiling a list of names from Pemberton's correspondence and appointment book. By noon, he had narrowed the field to 3 individuals who, in his words, merited the courtesy of a conversation before I trouble Scotland Yard with formal accusations. The first was Josiah Blackwood, proprietor of a rival establishment on Holborn, a heavy-set man with ink-stained fingers and a manner that shifted, disconcertingly, between wounded grief and barely concealed satisfaction as we sat in his cluttered back office. "Argus and I were rivals 30 years, Mr. Holmes, but rivals in trade, not in blood. I'll not pretend I'm sorry to see his best customers looking elsewhere now, but I never wished the man dead." He shifted in his chair. "Though I'll tell you plain, if it's the Raxford business you're asking after, I warned him. Told him more than once he was dealing in matters above his station, buying manuscripts of uncertain origin from men who didn't care to give their proper names." "You knew of the codex, then? Knew he'd got hold of something rare, 3 weeks back or thereabouts? Wouldn't say what, exactly. Cagey as a magpie about it, which wasn't like him. Argus generally couldn't resist boasting when he'd landed a fine piece." Blackwood's small eyes narrowed. That alone told me it was something he oughtn't have had at all. "Where were you, Mr. Blackwood, on the evening in question, between the hours of 6 and 9? Here? Alone? Doing my accounts? Same as poor Argus was doing his, I don't doubt, until whatever it was that stopped him." He spread his ink-stained hands. No one to vouch for it but myself, I'm sorry to say, but I never set foot near Cecil Court that night, and you'll find no proof that says otherwise, because there is none to find." Holmes thanked him with the particular blandness he reserved for witnesses whose statements he had not yet decided to believe or disbelieve, and we departed for our second interview. Pemberton's nephew, one Reginald Pemberton, a young man of perhaps 30, found in cramped lodgings off the Tottenham Court Road, whose relationship with his late uncle, it emerged within minutes of our arrival, had been anything but warm. "He cut me off 3 years back," Reginald said, not troubling to hide his bitterness, sprawled in a threadbare armchair with the particular carelessness of a man who has stopped pretending to grieve. "Told me I'd see not a farthing of the shop or its stock while he lived, and precious little when he died, unless I mended my ways," as he put it, as though a man can't be trusted with his own inheritance simply because he prefers cards to ledgers. "You had debts then, don't we all, Mr. Holmes?" Reginald's smile did not reach his eyes. "But if you're wondering whether I crept into my uncle's shop and poisoned his sweets, you may set your mind at ease. I hadn't spoken to the man in 8 months, and I certainly wasn't invited to his little office for tea and confectionery. And yet," Holmes said quietly, "you knew, without my mentioning it, that the poison was administered by way of a sweet." A silence fell over the room, brief but absolute. Reginald's face, for the first time, showed something other than practiced indifference. The constable who came to inform me of his death," he said, after a beat too long. "He mentioned it, in passing. Did he?" Holmes's tone remained perfectly level, but I saw the flicker in his eye that told me the detail had been noted, weighed, and filed away for later use. "Well, we shall not trouble you further this afternoon, Mr. Pemberton, though I suspect we shall speak again." It was our third and final call of the day that proved the most curious. A woman named Miss Cordelia Ashworth, whose name Holmes had found entered twice in Pemberton's appointment book over the preceding fortnight, received us in a small, elegant sitting room in Bloomsbury, her manner composed to the point of studied stillness. The stillness, I could not help but think, of a woman holding herself very carefully together. "I was a customer of Mr. Pemberton's, nothing more," she said, before Holmes had asked a single question. "I collect early botanical manuscripts. He had located, some weeks ago, a volume I had long sought. The Raxford Codex," Holmes said. "Not a question." Miss Ashworth's composure did not break, but her hands, folded in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't know the name." "Curious," Holmes said mildly, "given that it was you, I believe, who purchased it 2 days before his death. H.V. Hortensia." "No." He tilted his head, studying her with the frank, unhurried attention of a man assembling a puzzle in real time. "Cordelia. But your middle name, perhaps?" I confess, initials alone left the matter open to interpretation. "But I think, Miss Ashworth, we might dispense with the pretense, rather more quickly, if you were simply to tell me the truth." For a long moment, Miss Ashworth said nothing at all. Then, quietly, she rose, crossed to a small writing desk, and withdrew from its drawer a folded letter, which she held for a moment before extending it toward Holmes. "I did buy it," she said, "for rather more than I could comfortably afford, and rather more, I think, than the volume itself was truly worth. But I did not kill Argus Pemberton, Mr. Holmes, whatever this letter may suggest to you, and I received it, myself, only yesterday morning, hours before I learned that he was dead." Holmes unfolded the letter and read it in silence, his face giving away nothing, though I saw his eyes move once, sharply, back to a particular line, and read it again before he finally looked up. "Watson," he said, passing me the page without a word of explanation, "I think you had better read this for yourself." I took the letter, and as my eyes moved down the unsigned, hastily written lines, I understood, with a slow and creeping chill, precisely why Holmes's expression had changed so suddenly. For the letter was not addressed to Miss Ashworth at all, but had been, by every indication, intended for Argus Pemberton himself, and intercepted, somehow, before it ever reached him. "You were warned once already what would happen if the codex changed hands again without my consent." Consider this the last courtesy I intend to extend you. H. Chapter 5. The Hidden Ledger. The letter was meant for Pemberton, I said, still turning the page over in my hands as though a second reading might yield some detail the first had missed. And yet it was found in Miss Ashworth's possession, delivered to her by error or by design, that remains to be determined. Holmes turned back to our hostess, whose composure had, by degrees, begun to crack into something closer to genuine fear. Miss Ashworth, how came this letter into your hands, if it was never intended for you at all? It was delivered to my door yesterday morning by a boy I did not recognize, who told me only that it had been given to him with instructions to bring it to the lady who bought the book. I assumed, when I read it, that some mistake had been made, that I was never meant to see it, and that its true recipient had somehow failed to receive it in time. Her voice caught. I did not understand, until this very hour, quite how grave a mistake it must have been. You believe now that this letter, intended for Pemberton, warning him against selling the codex, was delivered to you, instead, deliberately, as a warning of your own. What else am I to think, Mr. Holmes? Her hands, no longer folded, trembled visibly now. Someone wished Argus dead for selling that book to me, and now wishes me to understand that I am not forgiven for having bought it. Holmes said nothing for a long moment, studying her with an expression I had come to recognize as genuine reassessment, the look of a man revising, mid-conversation, his estimation of a witness's culpability. Tell me about the Raxford Codex, Miss Ashworth. Not its provenance, which I suspect neither you nor Pemberton could fully vouch for, but what it is. What manner of document commands £1,000 and, apparently, a man's life? She hesitated, then rose again, and crossed to a locked drawer of her own, smaller, plainer than Pemberton's cabinet, but secured with the same wary care, and withdrew a slim volume bound in cracked brown leather, which she set upon the table between us, with the reverence of a woman handling something she only half trusted herself to touch. It purports to be a botanical manuscript from the 16th century, an herbal, cataloguing the medicinal and poisonous properties of English flora, annotated in a hand believed to belong to a physician of some renown in his day. That much is genuine, and valuable enough on its own account to a collector such as myself. She opened the cover with care, but bound into its final pages, added by a later hand, perhaps a century later, judging by the ink and script, is something else entirely. A ledger, of sorts, names, sums of money, and besides certain names, notations I did not, at first, understand. Holmes leaned forward, and I saw his eyes move swiftly down the page she indicated, his expression sharpening with each line. Blackmail, he said quietly. This is a blackmailer's private accounting, Watson, a record of payments extracted over the course of years from men and women whose names would still, I suspect, carry considerable weight in certain circles, bound cleverly within the pages of an innocuous herbal where no casual buyer would think to look for it. I did not realize what I held until some days after the purchase, Miss Ashworth said. By then, it was too late to pretend ignorance, even to myself. I ought to have taken it directly to the police. I confess I did not, because— She stopped. Because you recognized a name, Holmes said. It was not a question. Her silence was answer enough. I will not ask you to name it aloud, Holmes said, after a moment, with a gentleness I had rarely heard him extend to a witness he still, by his own admission, could not fully absolve of suspicion. Not yet. But I will ask you this. Did you tell anyone at all, what this volume contained, between the time of your purchase and today? No one. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I feared, the moment I understood what I held, that the knowledge itself was dangerous. I told no one, not even Argus, when I returned to ask him where precisely he had obtained the book. And what did he tell you? That he had bought it, along with a small parcel of other volumes, from a private seller some weeks prior. A man he described only as a gentleman recently returned from the continent, in need of funds and disinclined to explain further. He gave no name. Argus was not in the habit of pressing sellers for details he suspected they preferred to withhold. It was, he told me once, simply good business. Holmes rose and began to pace the length of the small sitting room, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that I understood to be, in truth, the shape of the case itself, turning slowly into clearer focus. "Then, let us set out what we now know," he said, "and see what remains obscure. A blackmail ledger, bound within an antique herbal, passes from an unknown seller to Pemberton, and from Pemberton to Miss Ashworth here, for a sum considerably beyond the volume's ordinary worth. A sum, I begin to suspect, that reflected not the value of the botany within, but the silence its buyer was, in effect, purchasing alongside it. Someone named within those pages learns, by whatever means, that the ledger has changed hands not once but twice, moving further from their control with each sale, and resolves to prevent it changing hands a third time by any means necessary." He stopped pacing abruptly. "Miss Ashworth, this herbal, you said it detailed poisonous properties of English flora." "Extensively, yes. It was, I believe, part of what made it valuable to a collector, even before I understood the ledger bound within it." "Does it include, by any chance, a detailed account of aconitite, monkshood, and its use as a cardiac poison?" Miss Ashworth's face went, if possible, a shade paler still. She turned to a page near the herbal's midpoint, and without a word, turned the book toward him. The page was headed, in faded but legible script, Aconitum napellus, and beneath it, in the same careful hand, a detailed account of its extraction, its symptoms, and, I noted with a chill that matched Miss Ashworth's own, its remarkably narrow window of detection in a body examined some hours after death. "Well," Holmes said softly, closing the volume with great care, "it would seem, Watson, that our poisoner did not merely know his method, he very possibly learned it from these very pages, which means the ledger we seek is not only a record of blackmail, but quite possibly a murder weapon in its own right, and I begin to suspect that whoever wants it back rather more urgently than we had first supposed." Chapter 5. The Hidden Ledger. "The letter was meant for Pemberton," I said, still turning the page over in my hands, as though a second reading might yield some detail the first had missed. "And yet it was found in Miss Ashworth's possession. Delivered to her by error, or by design, that remains to be determined." Holmes turned back to our hostess, whose composure had, by degrees, begun to crack into something closer to genuine fear. "Miss Ashworth, how came this letter into your hands, if it was never intended for you at all?" "It was delivered to my door yesterday morning by a boy I did not recognize, who told me only that it had been given to him with instructions to bring it to the lady who bought the book. I assumed, when I read it, that some mistake had been made, that I was never meant to see it, and that its true recipient had somehow failed to receive it in time." Her voice caught. I did not understand, until this very hour, quite how grave a mistake it must have been. "You believe now that this letter, intended for Pemberton, warning him against selling the codex, was delivered to you instead deliberately, as a warning of your own. What else am I to think, Mr. Holmes?" Her hands, no longer folded, trembled visibly now. "Someone wished Argus dead for selling that book to me, and now wishes me to understand that I am not forgiven for having bought it." Holmes said nothing for a long moment, studying her with an expression I had come to recognize as genuine reassessment. The look of a man revising, mid-conversation, his estimation of a witness's culpability. "Tell me about the Raxford Codex, Miss Ashworth, not its provenance, which I suspect neither you nor Pemberton could fully vouch for, but what it is. What manner of document commands £1,000 and, apparently, a man's life?" She hesitated, then rose again and crossed to a locked drawer of her own, smaller, plainer than Pemberton's cabinet, but secured with the same wary care, and withdrew a slim volume bound in cracked brown leather, which she set upon the table between us, with the reverence of a woman handling something she only half trusted herself to touch. It purports to be a botanical manuscript from the 16th century, an herbal, cataloguing the medicinal and poisonous properties of English flora, annotated in a hand believed to belong to a physician of some renown in his day. That much is genuine, and valuable enough on its own account to a collector such as myself. She opened the cover with care, but bound into its final pages, added by a later hand, perhaps a century later, judging by the ink and script, is something else entirely. A ledger of sorts. Names, sums of money, and besides certain names, notations I did not, at first, understand. Holmes leaned forward, and I saw his eyes move swiftly down the page she indicated, his expression sharpening with each line. "Blackmail," he said quietly. "This is a blackmailer's private accounting, Watson, a record of payments extracted over the course of years from men and women whose names would still, I suspect, carry considerable weight in certain circles, bound cleverly within the pages of an innocuous herbal where no casual buyer would think to look for it. I did not realize what I held until some days after the purchase," Miss Ashworth said. "By then, it was too late to pretend ignorance, even to myself. I ought to have taken it directly to the police. I confess I did not, because—" She stopped. "Because you recognized a name," Holmes said. It was not a question. Her silence was answer enough. "I will not ask you to name it aloud," Holmes said, after a moment, with a gentleness I had rarely heard him extend to a witness he still, by his own admission, could not fully absolve of suspicion. "Not yet. But I will ask you this. Did you tell anyone at all, what this volume contained, between the time of your purchase and today?" "No one." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I feared, the moment I understood what I held, that the knowledge itself was dangerous. I told no one, not even Argus, when I returned to ask him where precisely he had obtained the book. "And what did he tell you?" "That he had bought it, along with a small parcel of other volumes, from a private seller some weeks prior, a man he described only as a gentleman recently returned from the continent, in need of funds, and disinclined to explain further. He gave no name. Argus was not in the habit of pressing sellers for details he suspected they preferred to withhold. It was, he told me once, simply good business." Holmes rose and began to pace the length of the small sitting room, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that I understood to be, in truth, the shape of the case itself, turning slowly into clearer focus. "Then let us set out what we now know," he said, "and see what remains obscure. A blackmail ledger, bound within an antique herbal, passes from an unknown seller to Pemberton, and from Pemberton to Miss Ashworth here, for a sum considerably beyond the volume's ordinary worth. A sum, I begin to suspect, that reflected not the value of the botany within, but the silence its buyer was, in effect, purchasing alongside it. Someone named within those pages learns, by whatever means, that the ledger has changed hands not once but twice, moving further from their control with each sale, and resolves to prevent it changing hands a third time by any means necessary." He stopped pacing abruptly. "Miss Ashworth, this herbal, you said it detailed poisonous properties of English flora. Extensively. Yes, it was, I believe, part of what made it valuable to a collector, even before I understood the ledger bound within it. Does it include, by any chance, a detailed account of aconite, monkshood, and its use as a cardiac poison?" Miss Ashworth's face went, if possible, a shade paler still. She turned to a page near the herbal's midpoint, and without a word, turned the book toward him. The page was headed, in faded but legible script, Aconitum napellus, and beneath it, in the same careful hand, a detailed account of its extraction, its symptoms, and, I noted with a chill that matched Miss Ashworth's own, its remarkably narrow window of detection in a body examined some hours after death. "Well," Holmes said softly, closing the volume with great care. "It would seem, Watson, that our poisoner did not merely know his method. He very possibly learned it from these very pages, which means the ledger we seek is not only a record of blackmail, but quite possibly a murder weapon in its own right. And I begin to suspect that whoever wants it back rather more urgently than we had first supposed." Chapter 6. The Twist in the Evidence. We took our leave of Miss Ashworth as the light was failing, Holmes carrying the herbal, wrapped carefully in brown paper under one arm, his manner distracted in the particular way that told me some new configuration of the facts was assembling itself behind his eyes, even as we walked. The fog had thickened again with the evening, pressing close about the gas lamps of Bloomsbury, and it was not until we had gone the better part of a mile in silence that Holmes spoke at all. "There is a flaw in the theory as it presently stands, Watson, and I have been turning it over for the better part of an hour without satisfaction. The blackmail victim, striking to reclaim the ledger. What flaw do you find in it? It accounts for the motive, the method, even the poison itself, drawn from the very pages he sought to recover." "It accounts for a great deal," Holmes agreed, "but consider the sequence of events as we presently understand them. If our poisoner learned his method from these very pages, aconitum napellus, with its narrow window of detection, he must have had access to the herbal itself, or a very thorough second-hand account of its contents, before he ever poisoned Pemberton's sweets. And yet the sweets were poisoned, by every indication, on the very evening of Pemberton's death, a death that occurred, need I remind you, after the herbal had already passed from Pemberton's hands into Miss Ashworth's. I turned this over as we walked and felt the shape of the difficulty settle into place. "You mean the poisoner ought to have struck at Miss Ashworth, not Pemberton, if it was the book itself he wished to recover?" "Precisely so. Pemberton no longer possessed the ledger at the time of his death. He had sold it, and by his own admission to Miss Ashworth, sold it without pressing his mysterious continental seller for a name, which means Pemberton himself very likely never learned what he had truly been holding, let alone made use of any knowledge contained within it." Holmes's pace slowed further still. So why kill a man who had already parted with the very thing his killer sought to recover? "Unless the killer did not yet know the book had changed hands," I offered. "If he believed, at the time he sent the sweets, that Pemberton still held the ledger, then his motive holds, but his information does not. For the letter delivered to Miss Ashworth, warning her explicitly against having bought the codex, proves beyond doubt that our poisoner did know precisely where the book had gone, and precisely who now held it." Holmes stopped walking altogether, his eyes fixed on nothing, the fog curling around us both like a held breath. "Which means, Watson, that Pemberton was not killed to recover the ledger at all. He was killed for an entirely separate reason, and the letter to Miss Ashworth, threatening as it appears, may in truth be nothing more than a second unrelated thread we have mistaken, in our haste, for a continuation of the first. Two different hands, then, one poisoner, one letter-writer. Or one very clever individual, Watson, who wishes us to believe precisely what we very nearly believed a moment ago, that this is a simple case of a blackmail victim silencing the man who sold his secrets onward. A tidy theory, almost too tidy." Holmes resumed walking, faster now, his mind clearly some distance ahead of his feet. "We must return to Cecil Court. There is something in that shop I have not yet properly examined, and I begin to fear I have been so absorbed by the elegance of the codex that I have overlooked what was directly before me from the first hour of this investigation." We arrived to find the shop dark but for a single police lantern left burning within, a young constable stationed at the door who admitted us without question at Lestrade's earlier instruction. Holmes went directly to the locked cabinet we had noted the previous evening, now opened, its contents catalogued and removed to the yard, save for a single item the constable informed us had been left behind at Lestrade's own direction, judged too fragile to move without further instruction. A small framed photograph, half hidden until now behind the cabinet's false back panel, which Holmes drew out and held to the lantern light with an expression I had rarely seen him wear, something close to genuine astonishment. It was a photograph of two people, taken some years past by the look of the fashion depicted, a younger Argus Pemberton, unmistakable despite the passage of years, standing beside a woman whose face, though softened by youth in the image, I recognized at once from our visit that very afternoon. "Miss Ashworth," I said, staring, but she told us she was merely a customer, that she had known Pemberton only through his trade. "She did," Holmes said quietly, turning the frame over to reveal, on its reverse, a faded inscription in a hand I did not recognize, A and C, Brighton, 1889. Which means, Watson, that either Miss Ashworth has lied to us with a composure I confess I did not detect, an unsettling thought, given how closely I believed I was reading her, or there is a second Cordelia, somewhere in this affair, whom we have not yet had the pleasure of meeting. He set the photograph down with great care, his eyes narrowing in the lantern light with the particular intensity that told me, more clearly than any words could have, that the tidy shape of the case he had begun to assemble not an hour before had just come apart entirely in his hands, and that somewhere beneath the wreckage of that broken theory lay the true and rather darker truth of what had happened in this narrow, book-lined shop. Chapter 7. Holmes isolates the truth. Holmes did not speak again that night. He returned to Baker Street with the photograph wrapped carefully alongside the herbal, and when I rose the following morning, I found him precisely where I had left him, seated by the cold grate, the photograph propped against a stack of books before him, his dressing gown unchanged, his pipe long since gone out in his hand. "You have not slept," I said. "I have thought," Holmes replied, "which has answered rather better." He did not look up. "Sit, Watson, if you would indulge me. I find the case clarifies itself best when spoken aloud to a mind less cluttered than my own with its false starts." I sat, and he began, in the low, methodical voice he reserved for moments such as this. Not performance, but genuine reconstruction, thinking made audible. "We have established that Pemberton was killed not to recover the codex, which he no longer held, but for some separate reason entirely, a reason connected, I now believe, to this photograph, and to a name I did not think to ask Miss Ashworth directly, whether she had any family, any sister, any cousin who might share her Christian name or bear a sufficient resemblance to be mistaken for her at a distance of some years, in a faded photograph inscribed only with initials. He tapped the frame. A and C. Not Cordelia and Argus, Watson, as I first assumed. Observe the order. The inscription names the woman first, A, and Pemberton's own Christian name, if you recall the shop's gilt lettering, was not Argus at all in full. It was Argus Alistair Pemberton, a vain man, evidently in his youth, fond of alliteration in his own naming, if the inscription refers to him, as I now suspect it does not. You believe the A refers to someone else entirely. I believe, Watson, that we have been so dazzled by the elegance of the codex and its blackmail ledger that we overlooked the oldest motive in the criminal calendar, hiding in plain sight behind a locked cabinet panel, a love affair, decades old, and whatever grief or fury it left in its wake. Holmes rose at last and crossed to his desk, drawing out a sheet of paper on which he had, evidently in the small hours, sketched a rough chronology. I sent a boy at dawn to make inquiries at Somerset House. We shall have his answer within the hour, and I believe it will tell us a great deal about the true relationship between Argus Pemberton and the woman in this photograph, and whether Cordelia Ashworth is, in fact, the woman pictured, or someone considerably closer to her than mere resemblance would suggest. "A daughter," I said slowly, the thought arriving with the force of sudden clarity. "You believe Cordelia is Pemberton's daughter?" "I believe it is the likeliest explanation for a locked cabinet, a hidden photograph, and a woman who purchased a rare and valuable volume from a bookseller she claimed to know only as a tradesman, at a price considerably beyond what any collector, however devoted, generally pays without a very particular reason." Holmes's eyes were bright now with the fixed, unblinking focus I had learned to recognize as the final approach to a solution, still incomplete, but drawing rapidly closer. "Consider, Watson, if Cordelia Ashworth is indeed Pemberton's natural daughter, born of an affair in Brighton some 30 years past, and raised perhaps under another name entirely, she would have every reason to seek him out under an assumed pretext of trade, rather than reveal a connection that might have scandalized them both. And if some third party, the true author of that threatening letter, learned of this connection and resolved to exploit it, then the letter was never truly about the codex at all. I finished. It was a threat aimed at the relationship itself, at the secret of her parentage. Or, Holmes said, and here his voice dropped lower still, it was written by someone who believed that harming Pemberton would, in itself, constitute a sufficient blow against Cordelia, someone who resented the connection between them so bitterly that Pemberton's death was not merely a means to an end, but the end itself. A knock came at the door below, and moments later, Mrs. Hudson admitted the boy Holmes had sent to Somerset House, breathless from his errand, a folded certificate clutched in one hand. Holmes took it, scanned it once, and I watched his face settle into an expression of grim, quiet certainty. A birth registered in Brighton in the spring of 1890, he said, to one Cordelia Vane, the daughter, the record states, of Argus Alistair Pemberton and a woman named Anna Vane, unmarried at the time of the birth. He set the certificate down. Cordelia Ashworth, Watson, is very likely Cordelia Vane, grown to womanhood under her mother's maiden name, and only lately reunited, under careful pretext, with the father she had perhaps never been permitted to know openly. Then who wrote the letter? Who wished them both harm? Holmes did not answer at once. He crossed instead to the window, looking out over the fog-wrapped street below, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight I had rarely heard in it, not the bright satisfaction of a puzzle nearing solution, but something closer to sorrow, for a crime whose shape he had, at last, very nearly seen entire. There is one name, Watson, that has appeared at the edges of this case from its very first hour, and that I have, I confess, too readily dismissed as peripheral to the true matter at hand. A man who knew Pemberton's business intimately, who knew, better than any stranger could, the shape of his rivalries, his secrets, and, I begin to suspect, the existence of a daughter he had spent 30 years concealing from a world he judged unforgiving of such indiscretions. He turned from the window. "Send for Lestrade, if you would be so good. I believe it is time we paid a second call upon Mr. Josiah Blackwood, and this time I do not intend to let him retreat behind the comfortable alibi of an empty office and an unwitnessed evening." Chapter 8. The Trap and the Truth. Josiah Blackwood was not, as we had rather expected, at his shop on Holborn when Lestrade's men called that afternoon. He had, according to his own clerk, departed the previous evening on business, leaving no address behind him, a fact which, when relayed to Holmes, produced not alarm but a slow, satisfied nod, as of a man watching a piece fall precisely where he had calculated it must. "He has run," Lestrade said, pacing the small office we had commandeered at the yard. "That's as good as a confession, surely." "It is suggestive," Holmes allowed, "but a man does not run from a crime he believes undetected, unless something has frightened him into believing detection imminent. I wonder, Lestrade, whether word of our visit to Miss Ashworth yesterday reached him by some means we have not accounted for." It was Miss Ashworth herself, summoned that afternoon at Holmes's request, and now seated pale but composed in the corner of the office, who supplied the answer none of us had thought to seek. "Mr. Blackwood called upon me only last week," she said quietly, "before Argus's death. He came under the pretext of appraising a volume I had recently acquired. I did not think it strange at the time. Booksellers frequently consult one another on matters of provenance, but he asked a great many questions about where I had obtained it, and seemed, I thought afterward, unusually interested in whether I had shown it to anyone else. He knew then, Holmes said, that you held the Codex, some days before Pemberton's death, knew it directly from your own unsuspecting mouth, rather than through any confession of Pemberton's own. He rose and began once more the slow pacing that I had learned to recognize as the outward sign of a solution assembling itself into its final, complete form. Consider the sequence now, gentlemen, with Blackwood at its center rather than at its edge. A rival bookseller of 30 years' standing who admitted to us himself that he had warned Pemberton against dealing in matters above his station. A man with ready access to Pemberton's trade circle, his customers, his correspondence, and, I now suspect, to knowledge of a daughter Pemberton had kept hidden from the world for 3 decades, a secret Blackwood may have stumbled upon or been told in some unguarded moment of old friendship between rivals who had, after all, known one another the better part of their working lives. But what motive, I asked, beyond mere rivalry, would drive a man to poison another over a matter of trade? That, Holmes said, is what I intend to determine from the ledger itself, for I have had it examined overnight, Lestrade, at your kind permission, and I believe we shall find Josiah Blackwood's name entered within its pages, not as a witness to another man's blackmail, but as a victim of it. He withdrew a folded sheet from his coat, a transcription, in his own hand, of several entries from the hidden ledger, bound within the herbal. Here, a sum, paid quarterly for the better part of 6 years, against a notation reading only J.B. 1878 matter. I do not yet know what transpired in 1878 to render Josiah Blackwood vulnerable to such extraction, but I suspect Pemberton knew, whether as the original blackmailer himself, decades past, before some falling out drove the two rivals apart, or merely as a man who later came into possession of a record documenting another's old shame. You believe Pemberton was blackmailing Blackwood, Lestrade said slowly, and that Blackwood killed him to end it, and killed him with a poison drawn from the very book that proved his own extraction, as though closing the circle entirely. I believe it is the likeliest reading of the facts before us, Holmes said, though I intend to secure rather more than a likely reading before this matter goes before a jury, which is why, Lestrade, I have taken the liberty of arranging a small deception of my own. It was arranged, at Holmes's direction, that a notice be placed, discreetly, through a trusted intermediary in the book trade, informing Josiah Blackwood, wherever he had gone to ground, that a second copy of the Raxford Ledger's contents had been discovered among Pemberton's private papers, and that Miss Cordelia Ashworth intended to bring it before the police within the week, unless certain outstanding matters were first resolved to her satisfaction. It was, Holmes explained, a lure calculated to exploit precisely the vulnerability that had driven Blackwood to murder in the first place, the fear of exposure, dangled now a second time before a man who believed he had already silenced its source. Blackwood took the bait within 2 days, arriving at Miss Ashworth's Bloomsbury lodgings under cover of a foggy evening not unlike the one on which Pemberton had died, and found, waiting in her sitting room, instead of the frightened young woman he had expected, Sherlock Holmes himself, seated calmly beside the very herbal he had killed to suppress, with Lestrade and 2 constables positioned, unseen, in the adjoining room. The confession that followed was neither dramatic nor defiant, but the flat, exhausted admission of a man who had carried a decades-old shame for too long to summon any fight left in its defense. In 1878, as a young man new to the trade, Blackwood had forged a set of provenance documents for a manuscript he had known, even then, to be stolen, a single desperate act, committed to secure his footing in a competitive trade, that Pemberton had discovered some years later and held over him ever since, not through cruelty, Blackwood insisted, but through a kind of casual, ongoing extraction that had come to feel, over 6 long years of quarterly payments, like a permanent and inescapable tax upon his very survival. When he learned, through his careless conversation with Miss Ashworth, that the ledger recording his shame had passed into new and unknown hands, the old fear had returned with a violence that overwhelmed whatever remained of his conscience, and he had gone that same week to Pemberton's shop under cover of an old friendship. Entering by the long-disused coal chute, he alone, of all Pemberton's rivals, had known still existed from their younger days sharing deliveries between adjoining premises, and left behind him a box of poisoned sweets purchased that very afternoon, wrapped, he had believed, in an anonymity that would never be traced back to his own trembling hand. "You forgot," Holmes said quietly, as Lestrade's men led him away into the fog, "that a locked door tells a detective a great deal more about the man who did not need to use it than about the one who did." The Raxford Codex itself was returned, in time, to the Crown, its blackmail ledger placed beyond any further misuse. Miss Cordelia Ashworth, or Vane as her birth had named her, chose in the end to keep her connection to Argus Pemberton a private grief rather than a public scandal, and Holmes, for his part, never spoke of the matter again beyond a single dry observation, offered some weeks later over breakfast, that the oldest motives, love, shame, and 30 years of silence, remained, in his experience, rather more reliable than any newer vice for producing a truly memorable crime. And there, dear friends, we must draw our fog-wrapped evening to a close. We do hope you enjoyed following Holmes and Watson through the winding streets of Cecil Court tonight. Do let us know down in the comments what you made of the twist, and whether you suspected Mr. Blackwood before the final reveal. If you enjoyed your evening with us, we'd be so grateful if you'd give this story a like and subscribe for more. We've a great many more mysteries yet to share with you. Until next time, sleep well and dream only of quiet English villages.